Midnight in Chernobyl by Adam Higginbotham. Picture this. It's a warm spring night in the Soviet Union. You're a young lieutenant, just 26 years old, leading your men in an armored car. Your job is radiation reconnaissance. In fact, you're an expert. You've been trained at nuclear test sites, places where the Earth itself is poisoned from bombs. You've learned to respect radiation, not to fear it. But tonight is different. You're speeding toward an emergency at a place called the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. The air smells of trees and fresh grass. Your equipment hums quietly, detecting nothing unusual. And then, you pass a simple concrete sign marking the edge of the power station grounds. Suddenly, an alarm shrieks. The needle on your dosimeter jumps. 51 Röntgen per hour. That's the maximum radiation a soldier is allowed to receive during an entire war. And you're getting that dose every hour you sit here. But your orders are to get closer. As your armored car rumbles on, you see it. Reactor number 4. The 20-story building is torn open, blackened, and collapsed into rubble. A faint plume of steam drifts into the starry sky. You begin to circle the wreckage, your sergeant calling out the numbers. They climb steadily. 50, 100. 250 Röntgen an hour, the sergeant shouts. His eyes are wide with terror, and then he points at the new digital radiometer. You look down. The number on the screen is 2080. 2080 Röntgen an hour, an impossible number, a lethal dose in minutes. In that moment, all your training, all your confidence vanishes. The love for radiation you once felt turns to pure, primal terror. You hear yourself screaming at your driver, "If this thing dies, we'll all be corpses in 15 minutes." What you've just heard is a true story, a single moment from the opening hours of the greatest nuclear disaster in human history. It's a story that has been shrouded in secrets, lies, and propaganda for decades, but today we're going to pull back the curtain. We're diving into Adam Higginbotham's masterpiece, Midnight in Chernobyl. This isn't just a book. It's a gripping work of investigative journalism that reads like a thriller. It pieces together a puzzle that an entire empire tried to hide. By the end of our journey today, you'll understand not just what happened on that catastrophic night in April 1986, but why it was almost destined to happen. You'll see how a dream of a perfect future, a city built for heroes of the peaceful atom, was brought to ruin by a system that valued ambition over truth and secrecy over safety. This is more than a history lesson. It's a profound story about human nature, courage, and the devastating cost of a single lie, multiplied by 1,000,000. Our story begins not with an explosion, but with a dream, a Soviet dream, forged in the snows of Ukraine in the winter of 1970. Imagine a young, ambitious man named Viktor Brukhanov, just 34 years old, standing in a frozen field. He's been sent from Moscow with an audacious mission to build the greatest nuclear power station on Earth. This wasn't just another construction project. This was the birth of an Atomgrad, an atomic city. The city would be called Pripyat, and it was designed to be a worker's paradise. For the young families and brilliant engineers drawn from all corners of the Soviet Union, Pripyat was a promise of a better life. The stores were stocked with goods you couldn't find even in the capital city of Kyiv: fresh meat, French perfume, Austrian furniture. There were schools, swimming pools, a cinema, even a yacht club. The average age was just 26. It was a city of the future, a testament to the power of what they called the peaceful atom. On a rooftop overlooking the main square, a proud slogan declared, "Let the atom be a worker, not a soldier." At the heart of this dream was a new kind of nuclear reactor, a symbol of Soviet ambition and technical pride, the RBMK-1000. In keeping with the Soviet love for all things gigantic, the RBMK was a behemoth, a graphite-moderated, water-cooled machine 20 times the size of a typical Western reactor, capable of generating 1,000 megawatts of electricity. It was hailed as the national reactor of the USSR, a triumph of socialist engineering. But behind this proud facade a dark and dangerous secret was hiding. A secret that began with the very birth of the Soviet atomic program. To understand what went so terribly wrong at Chernobyl, you have to understand that the Soviet nuclear industry was born not from a desire for peaceful energy, but from the desperate, paranoid race to build an atomic bomb. It was a world run by a clandestine organization so secret its name was a code, the Ministry of Medium Machine Building, or SREDMASH. This was a state within a state, with its own cities, its own scientists, its own army, and its own impenetrable wall of silence. In this world, any accident, no matter how small, was treated as a state secret, policed by the KGB. The men who designed the first Soviet reactors were brilliant, but they were also driven by ruthless expediency. They cut corners, they prioritized speed and cost over safety. And the RBMK reactor, the pride of the civil nuclear program, was a direct descendant of the military reactors, designed to produce plutonium for warheads. It carried its dangerous military DNA within it. So, what was this fatal flaw? To put it simply, the RBMK had a design defect known as a positive void coefficient. Now that sounds complicated, but think of it like this. In most reactors, if they start to overheat, the chain reaction naturally slows down. It's like a car that automatically eases off the gas if the engine gets too hot. But in the RBMK, the opposite happened. As it got hotter, the nuclear reaction would actually speed up, creating more heat, which would speed up the reaction even more. It was a runaway feedback loop, a car with the accelerator wired to the brake pedal. The only thing stopping this from happening was a complex system of control rods that the operators had to manage perfectly every single second. The designers knew about this danger, but they kept it a secret. In 1975, 11 years before Chernobyl, a similar RBMK reactor at the Leningrad nuclear power plant experienced a partial meltdown because of this very flaw. A secret commission investigated and concluded that the reactor had serious design faults. They recommended urgent safety upgrades, but the findings were suppressed by SREDMASH. The operators at Chernobyl and at other plants across the country were never told about the Leningrad accident or the true dangers of the machine they were running. And there was another, even more terrifying secret hidden within the reactor's emergency shutdown system. The system was called AZ-5, and it was activated by a single red button, the scram button. In any emergency, pushing that button was supposed to drive all the control rods into the core and kill the nuclear reaction instantly. But the designers, in an attempt to make the reactor more economical, had given the control rods graphite tips. Here's what that meant. For a few fatal seconds, as the rods first entered the core, the graphite tips would actually increase the reactor's power before the rest of the rod could shut it down. Under a very specific but possible set of conditions, pushing the emergency stop button would not stop the reactor. It would make it explode. The scientists discovered this positive scram effect in 1983 during the startup of Chernobyl's Unit 4 itself. They sent warnings. But again, nothing was done. The warning never reached the men in the control room. And so, the stage was set for tragedy. A flawed machine, a culture of secrecy, and a crew of operators who had been kept in the dark about the monster they were trying to control. Which brings us to the night of Friday, April 25, 1986. Unit 4 was scheduled for a routine maintenance shutdown, but before powering it down, the engineers were ordered to run a safety test. It was a test of the emergency cooling system, ironically designed to see if the plant could survive a total blackout. The test had been delayed for years, and the plant director, Viktor Brukhanov, had been pressured to sign off on the reactor's completion without it ever being successfully done. Now his deputies were determined to finally get it over with. The man in charge that night was the deputy chief engineer, Anatoly Dyatlov. Dyatlov was a brilliant physicist, but also a stubborn, arrogant, and bullying manager who had learned his trade installing reactors in nuclear submarines. He was known for screaming at his subordinates and demanding absolute obedience. He believed he was always right. The test was supposed to begin in the afternoon, but a delay from the Kyiv grid controller pushed it late into the night. By the time the midnight shift arrived, the experienced crew who had been briefed on the test had already gone home. Taking over the controls was a 25-year-old senior engineer named Leonid Toptunov. He was brilliant, but he had only been in the job for 2 months. It was his first time ever performing a shutdown. The test procedure required the reactor to be held at a stable power level of at least 700 megawatts. But Dyatlov, impatient and exhausted, insisted they run it at just 200 megawatts, a dangerously unstable level. The shift foreman, Alexander Akimov, argued with him, but Dyatlov overruled him. "I know better," he insisted. Then the young operator Toptunov made a mistake. While trying to switch control modes, he accidentally let the reactor's power plummet to almost zero. The reactor was being poisoned by a buildup of xenon gas, making it incredibly difficult to raise the power again. At this point, safety regulations were crystal clear. They should have aborted the test and shut the reactor down immediately. But Dyatlov refused. Enraged, he ordered Toptunov to raise the power by pulling out more and more control rods. Toptunov knew this was a violation of procedure and would leave the reactor in an incredibly dangerous state. He refused. "I'm not going to raise the power," he said. Dyatlov threatened him. He told Toptunov that if he didn't follow orders, his career would be over. Terrified of losing his job, his home in the paradise of Pripyat, the young man gave in. For the next hour, they struggled to revive the poisoned reactor, pulling out almost all of the control rods, far beyond the legal safety limit. The RBMK was now a wild horse, barely under control. The pistol was cocked. At 1:23 in the morning, on Saturday, April 26th, the test finally began. For 36 seconds, everything seemed calm. Then, Akimov gave the final order: "Shut down the reactor, a Z5." Leonid Toptunov pressed the big red button. High above them, the 211 control rods began their slow descent into the core, and for one brief second, reactivity started to fall. But then, the graphite tips entered the bottom of the core. Suddenly, a massive power surge began in the lower part of the reactor. Alarms screamed across the control room. "Power surge!" Toptunov yelled. Akimov screamed at him to shut it down again, but it was too late. The control rods were jammed. The power leaped to more than 100 times its maximum level in less than 3 seconds. The fuel channels ruptured. A colossal steam explosion, with the force of 60 tons of TNT, tore the reactor apart. The 2,000-ton concrete lid, a shield called Elena, was thrown into the air like a coin. It demolished the walls and the roof of the reactor hall, exposing the glowing, incandescent core to the night sky. In that single, catastrophic moment, 7 tons of radioactive fuel and graphite were vaporized and blasted into the atmosphere, creating a lethal plume that would soon begin its silent journey across the world. In his workspace nearby, a senior engineer named Alexander Yevchenko felt the concrete walls buckle like rubber. The lights went out. His first thought was not a nuclear accident. It was something far more familiar to a Soviet citizen. Finally, he thought, the war with the Americans has begun. The seconds after the explosion were a scene of utter chaos and disbelief. In the control room, dust and tiles rained from the ceiling. Deputy Chief Dyatlov, the man who had pushed them all to the brink, couldn't comprehend what had just happened. He and the others still believed the reactor was intact. Their minds simply could not process the idea that a Soviet reactor could explode. His first command was to get water into the reactor. "Lads," he said, "we've got to get water into the reactor." Akimov and Toptunov, the 2 men at the control panel, obeyed. They would spend the next few hours wading through radioactive water in the dark, trying to manually open coolant valves, convinced they were fighting to prevent a meltdown, when in fact they were sealing their own fate. Outside, the first firefighters from Paramilitary Fire Station No. 2 arrived within minutes of the alarm. They were led by a 23-year-old lieutenant named Vladimir Pravik. They saw flames on the roof of the turbine hall and the reactor building, but they had no idea what they were walking into. They were firefighters. Their job was to put out fires. They were never told about the invisible danger of radiation. They climbed onto the roofs of Unit 3 and the turbine hall, their boots crunching on what they thought was just debris. But it wasn't just debris. It was chunks of superheated graphite and nuclear fuel, blasted directly from the core. These pieces were emitting thousands of Röntgen per hour, a lethal dose in minutes. The men fought the fires with water, but some of the blazes seemed to burn even more fiercely when they hosed them down. They were, without knowing it, pouring water onto burning uranium fuel, which released explosive hydrogen gas and radioactive steam. Soon, the men began to feel sick. They felt a metallic taste in their mouths. Their faces turned a deep, unnatural tan. Then came the uncontrollable vomiting. One by one, they started to collapse. These were the first symptoms of acute radiation syndrome, or ARS. Their bodies were, at a cellular level, being torn apart. While the firefighters were dying on the roof, the plant director, Viktor Brukhanov, was woken by a phone call. He rushed to the bunker beneath the administrative building, but like his engineers, he refused to believe the reactor was destroyed. At 3 a.m. he called his bosses in Moscow and reported an explosion and a fire, but assured them that the reactor was intact and was being supplied with cooling water. This was the first official lie, the lie that would shape the catastrophic response for days to come. As dawn broke, the scale of the disaster became horrifyingly clear to anyone who could see it. The reactor was gone, yet the official denial continued. Moscow was being told there was no serious radiation release, and that everything was under control. The first victims, the operators and firefighters, were taken to the local hospital in Pripyat, overwhelming the staff. Soon the most severely irradiated patients were flown to a secret, specialized clinic in Moscow, Hospital No. 6. Among them were the firefighters Pravik and Vasily Ignatenko, and the operators Akimov, Toptunov, and Alexander Yuvchenko. What followed for these men was a slow, agonizing descent into hell. ARS is a cruel disease. After the initial nausea, there is a latency period, a deceptive phase, where the patient can feel perfectly fine for days, or even weeks. But inside, their cells are dying. Their immune systems collapse. Their skin develops horrific burns that turn black and peel away. Their internal organs disintegrate. The doctors in Moscow, led by the formidable Dr. Angelina Guskova, did everything they could. They tried experimental bone marrow transplants, flying in specialists from America, including Dr. Robert Gale. But for the most heavily exposed, nothing could be done. They had absorbed doses so high their bodies themselves had become radioactive. One by one they died, 28 men in the first few months. Their bodies were so contaminated they had to be buried in sealed zinc coffins, under slabs of concrete, in a special section of a Moscow cemetery. While these men were dying in Moscow, the world still knew nothing, but the secret couldn't be contained. The radioactive cloud, carrying iodine-131, cesium-137, and plutonium, was drifting northwest on the wind. On the morning of Monday, April 28th, more than 2 days after the explosion, a technician at the Forsmark nuclear power plant in Sweden was walking into work when he set off a radiation alarm. The plant staff were confused. They couldn't find any leak inside their own facility, but then they checked the grass outside. It was highly radioactive. They realized the radiation was coming from somewhere else. The Swedes traced the wind patterns back across the Baltic Sea toward the Soviet Union. They demanded answers from Moscow. Cornered, with the evidence now undeniable, the Soviet government finally made a brief, 23-word announcement on the nightly news program Vremya. They admitted there had been an accident at the Chernobyl power plant. It was the 21st item in the news report. The lie had been exposed. The world now knew, and the Kremlin was thrown into a panic. Mikhail Gorbachev, the new, reform-minded leader, was faced with a crisis that threatened his entire agenda of openness, or glasnost. A government commission led by a tough deputy prime minister named Boris Sherbina was sent to the scene. What they found was an apocalyptic nightmare. The reactor was still burning, spewing radionuclides into the air. They realized they had to do something to smother the fire. And so began what would come to be called the Battle of Chernobyl. The first idea was to bomb the reactor from the air. General Nikolai Antoshkin commanded a fleet of helicopters whose pilots made heroic, terrifying flights directly over the glowing crater, which they nicknamed the volcano. They dumped thousands of tons of sand, clay, lead, and boron into the reactor, hoping to put out the graphite fire and stop the chain reaction. The pilots flew through clouds of radioactive dust, their cabins unprotected, absorbing huge doses of radiation. But the bombing campaign created a new, even more terrifying problem. The weight of all that material was causing the temperature inside the reactor to rise. The scientists feared the worst-case scenario, a full meltdown. They worried that a molten mass of nuclear fuel, a radioactive lava they called, corium, could burn through the concrete floors beneath the reactor. Beneath the reactor were massive pools of water, part of the emergency suppression system. If the molten corium reached that water, it would trigger a second steam explosion, one so powerful it could destroy the entire plant, vaporize the remaining 3 reactors, and render a huge swath of Europe uninhabitable for 100 years. They had to drain those pools, and the only way to do it was to send men down into the flooded radioactive basement to manually open the valves. 3 men volunteered for what everyone believed was a suicide mission: Alexei Ananenko, Valery Bespalov, and Boris Boranov. Wading through darkness in contaminated water, they found the valves and opened them, saving Europe from a second, far greater catastrophe. All 3 survived. At the same time, thousands of coal miners were brought in to tunnel beneath the reactor to install a massive heat exchanger, a desperate attempt to cool the melting core from below. They worked in unbearable heat and high radiation, digging around the clock. By early May, the fire was finally out, but the battle was far from over. The entire area around the plant was now one of the most contaminated places on Earth. The Politburo ordered the mobilization of what would eventually become an army of over 500,000 men, known as the liquidators. These were reservists, miners, construction workers, and conscripts, summoned from all over the Soviet Union to clean up the disaster. Their work was brutal and often improvised. They washed down buildings, cut down entire forests, and scraped up tons of radioactive topsoil with shovels. One of the most dangerous jobs was clearing the roofs of the plant, which were littered with deadly chunks of graphite and fuel. The radiation was so intense that the electronics of the robots they sent in failed. So they sent in men. They called them bio-robots. Wrapped in crude, homemade lead armor, they were allowed to spend only seconds or minutes on the roof, running out with a shovel to throw 1 or 2 pieces of debris into the crater before sprinting back. In those few moments, many received their lifetime limit of radiation, or more. Over 3,000 men were sent to the roof. The final, monumental task of the liquidation was to entomb the ruined reactor forever. In just 206 days, working in horrific conditions, the liquidators built a massive steel and concrete structure over Unit 4. They called it the sarcophagus. It was a triumph of Soviet engineering and brute force, but it was also built in a hurry, with steel held together by gravity, not welds. While this heroic battle was being waged on the ground, another, secret battle was being fought in the halls of the Kremlin. The investigation into the accident was a hunt for scapegoats. The powerful men who designed the reactor, Anatoly Alexandrov, the head of the Soviet Academy of Sciences, and Nikolai Dolezal, the chief designer, used all their influence to blame the operators. The official report, delivered to the world at the International Atomic Energy Agency in Vienna in August 1986, presented by a senior scientist named Valery Legasov, was a carefully constructed narrative. It claimed the accident was caused by a series of reckless and improbable mistakes by the plant workers, who violated one safety rule after another. The report barely mentioned the reactor's design flaws. It was a public relations triumph for the Soviet Union. In July 1987, Viktor Brukhanov, Anatoly Dyatlov, and Nikolai Fomin were put on trial in the abandoned town of Chernobyl. It was a show trial. Key evidence about the reactor's flaws was classified as top secret and never presented to the court. All three men were found guilty and sentenced to 10 years in a labor camp. But the truth could not stay buried forever. Valery Legasov, the scientist who had presented the official story to the world, was consumed by guilt. He knew the full story of the RBMK's flaws and the arrogance of the scientific establishment. He tried to speak out, but he was silenced and ostracized by his peers. On the second anniversary of the accident, he recorded a series of secret tapes, a final confession detailing the whole hidden history of the disaster. Then, he hanged himself. Legasov's suicide sent a shockwave through the Soviet system. His tapes were published, and the truth about the RBMK's design flaws finally came out. The story of human error began to crumble, replaced by a far more disturbing story of systemic failure. In the end, Mikhail Gorbachev himself would say that Chernobyl, more than anything else, was the real cause of the collapse of the Soviet Union. The disaster exposed the rot at the heart of the system, the secrecy, the lies, the incompetence. It shattered the people's faith in their government and unleashed a wave of environmental and nationalist movements that the crumbling empire could not contain. Today, Pripyat is a ghost town, slowly being reclaimed by nature. The sarcophagus, which was only designed to last for 30 years, began to crumble, and a new, even more gigantic structure, the new safe confinement, has been built to slide over it, a tomb for a tomb, designed to last another 100 years. And inside, in the dark, silent ruins of reactor number 4, lies what the scientists who explored it called the elephant's foot, a congealed mass of molten nuclear fuel, concrete, and sand. It remains so radioactive that just 5 minutes in its presence would be enough to guarantee an agonizing death. It is a permanent, deadly monument to the moment when a dream of a perfect future turned into a waking nightmare. As we step back from this incredible, harrowing story, what are we left with? Midnight in Chernobyl is so much more than a historical account of a technological failure. It's a profound and timeless lesson about the nature of truth itself. The central tragedy of Chernobyl wasn't just a nuclear explosion, it was an explosion of lies. A system built on secrecy, where bad news was buried and inconvenient truths were ignored, created a machine that was destined to fail. The scientists who knew about the reactor's flaws stayed silent. The managers who were pressured to meet impossible deadlines cut corners. The operators who were kept in the dark were blamed when the inevitable happened. Every step of the way, a small compromise with the truth, a small act of looking the other way, added another layer of fuel to the fire. When the disaster struck, the first instinct of the system was not to save lives, but to save face, to control the narrative, to build a wall of silence around the truth, just as they would later build a wall of concrete around the reactor. The initial delay in telling the world, the delay in evacuating Pripyat, the lies told to the liquidators about the dangers they faced, all of these were born from the same corrosive instinct, to deny reality. This story matters today more than ever. We live in a world overflowing with information, but it's often harder than ever to know what's true. We see leaders and institutions that prioritize ideology over facts and public image over public safety. Chernobyl is a stark reminder of where that path leads. It shows us that reality has a way of asserting itself, often in the most brutal and catastrophic ways. You can't negotiate with physics. You can't spin a chain reaction. But this is also a story of incredible human courage. The firefighters who climbed onto that radioactive roof, with no real understanding of the invisible enemy they were fighting, were simply doing their job. The miners who tunneled beneath the melting core, the pilots who flew through the radioactive plume, the liquidators who scraped the poison from the earth with their bare hands, these were ordinary people who were called upon to do something extraordinary, to sacrifice themselves for the sake of others. Their story is a testament to the resilience of the human spirit in the face of unimaginable horror. So what can we take from this? The most practical lesson from Chernobyl isn't about nuclear engineering. It's about the importance of building a culture of honesty. It's about creating environments, in our work, in our communities, in our own lives, where people feel safe to speak up, to point out flaws, to tell the truth even when it's uncomfortable. It's about understanding that the small, everyday choices to be truthful or to look the other way can have consequences we can't even imagine. That was a look inside midnight in Chernobyl by Adam Higginbotham. We've walked through the key events and ideas today, but I have to be honest with you. A summary can only ever be a map. The real treasure is found when you make the journey yourself. The real power of this book is in the meticulous detail, the heart-wrenching human stories, and the chilling, minute-by-minute account of the disaster as it unfolded. This summary is designed to help you decide if this story is one you need to explore more deeply. If anything we've discussed today has sparked your curiosity or touched your heart, I urge you to grab a copy. Reading it isn't just about learning history. It's an experience that will change the way you think about truth, power, and the world we live in. You can find a link to the book in the description below. Also, if you found this summary valuable, and you'd like to continue exploring the world's most impactful books with me, please take a moment to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. It lets me know that this work is making a difference, and it ensures you won't miss our next journey into another life-changing book. Let's keep learning and growing together.